how to create worlds, material, level sequence, SoundCue, and even more than that with C++ in Unreal. Actually, all the assets that you can create by right-clicking in the content browser are all created pretty much the same way, and we're going to look at it today, so let's get to it. So as usual, I'm in an empty header file, and we're going to add all our new functions in there, but we're going to do a little something different today. We're going to start by the forward declaration, just because it's going to be simpler for me to tell you what exactly we're going to do today. So first, the first forward declaration we're going to need is the UE5 factory. That class is going to help us create all the different kind of assets that we want to create today. And actually, that's also the class that we have to use to create any type of assets in Unreal because they are all created by a factory. And then we have all the different assets we're going to create today. So here is my little list. It's nothing compared to all the different asset types you can create in Unreal using the factory system. But in my case, since I don't want to create a 3-hour long video, I'm just going to limit myself to those assets right here. So we're still going to have a world, a material, a level sequence, a NiagaraSystem, a SoundCue, and also an Enum and a structure. So we really have a little bit of variety right here, and we're really going to create all those different asset types using the same technique. So good, now we're done with the forward declaration, we can jump into the functions. And actually, since we have a few functions to create, I'm just going to scroll down a little bit so we can focus on them. And the first function that we're going to create is the create asset function. And that function is actually going to be the main function in today's video because we're going to call this function for any type of asset we want to create. All the assets that we want to create are going to go through that function, so the create asset function. And to be able to execute that function, well, we first need the path of the asset where we want to create the asset in the content browser, obviously, and then we need the class of the asset. So which type of asset we want to create? Do we want to create a world, a level sequence, a NiagaraSystem, a SoundCue, or anything else? This is where we're going to specify which type of asset we want to create. And then we can also provide the factory that we want to use to create the asset. That parameter is going to be optional. If we don't provide a factory, the function is going to generate it for you. But in the case that you have some specific parameters that you want to apply during the creation, well, you can create your own factory before calling the function and then provide it to the function. So that's pretty nice. So good. With all those information, the function is going to be able to create an asset for you, and at the end of the function, it's going to return it to you so you can do anything you want with it. So yeah, most of the logic we're going to do today is going to be inside that function because that's the function doing everything. But since I want my user to have a simpler experience and an easier way to create an asset, I'm also going to create a bunch of other functions that are going to create one specific type of asset. So for example, I have a function that is specifically used to create a world asset. And from the user's perspective, this function is way simpler to use than the create assets function because we don't have to specify which asset class we want to create. It's obvious we want to create a world and which factory to use because we're just going to create the factory inside that function right here. And that means that to be able to call this function, the user only has to know where he wants to save the asset in the content browser, and that's a super simple information to provide. And as output, the function is going to directly return a uWorld because that's what we're going to create by calling the create asset function. And we're going to do the exact same thing for all the other asset types we want to create today. So I'm just going to scroll down a little bit more right here because we're going to create all the other functions to create all the different asset types. So the next function is going to be the function that creates a material for us. So the create material asset function. This function, same thing, we just have to provide the asset path and it's going to create the factory in the class that we want to create, and as output it's going to return us a material directly. Then we have the function that creates a level sequence asset. Same thing, we have to provide the path and it's going to return us the level sequence as output. And then I'm going to scroll down a little bit more because we have more functions. So create a NiagaraSystem asset. Same thing, we're filling it the asset path and it's going to return us the NiagaraSystem as output. And then create the SoundCue asset. Same thing, asset path, and then it returns the SoundCue. And I have two other functions actually. So yeah, I think I went a little bit overboard with the examples for today. Here we go. So the two last functions are creating an enum asset and a struct asset. The asset types for both of those are user defined enum and user defined struct. Perfect. So we're finally done with the functions. Now it's time to jump in the CPP. So in the CPP file, as usual, we're going to start with the includes. And the first include we're going to need is actually the AssetToolModule. That's the object that we're going to use to create all our different type of asset. We have to go through that object to create the asset. So let's do that. Well, Then the next thing we need is all the different asset types we want to create. So these are mine. We want to create a world, a material, LevelSequence, NiagaraSystem, SoundCue, an Enum, and a structure. So these are all the includes I'm going to need in today's video because I want to create all those different asset types. And obviously, if you want to create different asset types, you have to include them also. Make sure to remember which module contains the different asset types because we have to include those modules inside the build.cs file as usual. But before we do that, there's one last thing we have to include, and it is the factory. Actually, you don't have to include it if you don't want to use the factories, but in my case, since I want to show you an example on how to use the factories, I'm going to include two factories. I want to use the world factory and also the material factory to create the world and the material assets. So these are really just specifically used to create a world and a material. If you want to create some other type of asset using the factories, you're going to have to include them. And if you want to have the complete list of all the factories that are available in the engine, you can refer to the documentation right here. You can access all the factories right here. But there's just one little problem though. Not all the factories are going to be available to you by code because some factories are actually stored inside private modules for some reason. I don't really know the full explanation on that. If you want to read on it, you can just look at this link right here. But in some cases, you cannot include the factories in your project. So for example, the LevelSequence editor factory, you cannot access it. Same thing for the NiagaraSystem factory. But actually, don't worry too much because the factories are not that useful when you're creating objects. They are just used to set some variables here and there, but actually those variables don't really matter too much in most cases. And you're gonna see that today. We're going to create all those different asset types without going through the factories because actually we don't need those. And really, the only reason why I'm going to use factories today, it's really just to show you how to use them, but I'm not using them usually. So yeah, they are not that useful, so don't worry about not being able to include most of them. Anyways, enough chatting, now it's time to go make sure that all the different modules right here are already inside the build.cs file. So I'm gonna go in there and then do I have? No, I don't. I'm missing the LevelSequence and also the Niagara module. So let's make sure to add them both right here, otherwise it's not going to compile. So I have my both modules, the new modules right there, and now we can go back in the CPP to focus on the functions. So good, now I can scroll down a little bit right here. And now to create the asset, the first step is to access the asset tool module. So we have the asset tool module right here. I'm just saving it into a new variable. We're going to ask the asset tool module to import the asset for us, or actually to create the asset for us. So now we have the asset tool module. The second step is to make sure that the factory is ready for the creation of the asset, because even though I said that the factory is not that really useful to create an asset, we still have to specify which factory to use when we want to create an asset. Otherwise, the asset tool module is not gonna know how to process the asset. So what we're gonna do is just make sure that the factory makes sense and it's ready to be used. So in my case, I'm just going to take the factory that we receive as input and I'm just going to save it into a new local variable. What I'm gonna do with that variable is to check if that variable is valid or not, because as I said, I don't want that variable right here as input to be mandatory. I want it to be optional. So the user can decide if he wants to provide a factory or not. And if it doesn't provide a factory, well, this factory right here is going to be null, and then we can provide the factory for him. And that's exactly what we're gonna do. If the factory we receive as input is not valid, we're going to find the right factory for us. So to do that, I'm just going to loop through all the factories that are already available inside the asset tool module. So here I'm getting all the assets factories. The function is a little bit weird. It says get new asset factories, but actually it just gets you the list of all the available factories that are in the asset tool. So we're getting all the factories that are available. We're looping through all of them. And for each of those factories, we're just going to check, okay, is the supported class of that factory the same as the class we want to create? So if we want to create a material, is the supported class of that factory a material, or is it a world, or is it a NiagaraSystem? In our case, we want to make sure that it is the same type as the asset we want to create. And as soon as we find the factory that support that asset type, well, we're just going to use it as our factory for our asset creation. So here, I'm just setting my factory using the factory I'm looping through right here. I'm setting my factory and that's it. I can exit the loop because I found a factory that supports the asset type I want to create. And then right after that, I'm going to check if the factory that we found during the loop is valid. So right here, I'm just checking, okay, did we find a factory during our loop? Did we find any factory that supports supports our asset class. If so, that factory is not going to be null and we'll be able to use it. But if it's still null after the loop is completed, it means that we didn't find a factory that was able to support that asset type. And that also means that we're not going to be able to create the asset. So I'm just returning right here because, well, we're not going to be able to create the asset without a factory. Good. So now we should have a valid factory right here. So I'm just going to ask it to create the asset. But before doing that, I'm just going to add another check here. I'm going to make sure that the factory that we have right here can support the asset class that we want to create. Because if we provided a valid factory at the beginning, it doesn't mean that that valid factory is able to support the asset type we want to create. If we receive the factory as input and that factory was not able to support the asset class we try to process, well, we're not going to be able to create that asset either. We really need a factory that supports the same asset class that we want to create. So here I'm just going to return false as well because the factory cannot create the desired asset class, so we cannot use that factory to create the asset. Good. Okay, so now we're sure that the factory is perfect and it's ready to be used. So I'm just gonna scroll down a little bit to process the import. I'm just gonna scroll all the way here. And the next step is actually super simple. We just have to ask the asset tool to process the asset creation. So here, asset tool, create the asset for us, please. And then we have to feed it a few parameters. The first parameter is just the file name of the asset we want to create, so only the last part of my asset path, and then we also have to feed it the path of the asset we want to create without the asset name. So here it is, I have my asset path and this is my asset file name. Here we go. I don't know why we have to feed it into part just like that, but that's how it works, so whatever. And then we have to specify which asset class we want to create, and it's the asset class we receive as input, and finally the factory we want to use to create that asset. Perfect. So now this function should now be able to create the asset for us, and as output, if it worked, it's going to return us the object of the asset it just created. Perfect. And now I'm just going to add one last little check to see if the asset creation actually works. So if the asset is null pointer right here, it means that the asset creation didn't work. And if it didn't work, well, it's probably because the path was not valid. So you provided a path that didn't make sense. Or if there's already an asset that exists with that name, you cannot create another asset on top of it. So these are the two main reasons why you're not able to create an asset at that point. So here I'm just returning a little bit more information. But if the asset was created properly, then I can just return it at the end of the function right here because I was able to create the asset successfully. Okay, good. So now we're done with the big chunk of today's video, and now it's just time to do all the other wrapper functions right here. So I'm just gonna scroll down a little bit right here, and we're gonna start with the create world asset. And for this one, and also for the material asset, we're going to use factories because I want to show you how to use a factory and provide it to the create asset function we created before. So to use a factory to create a world asset, well, it's simple. You just have to create the factory. So here I'm creating a new object of type uWorld factory, which is the type of factory that creates a world asset. It's in the name. That's pretty obvious. So good. We now have a factory that lets us create a world, and you can use that factory to set a few settings here and there. So these are the main settings that you can set when creating a uWorld. And in my case, I'm never really using those settings. I don't really actually know what they do. So here you can inform the engine of the world. So do you want to inform Unreal that you created a world? For some reason, by default, it's false. I don't know why. And then you can create a world partition if you want to. And finally, you can set the feature level of your level that you're trying to create. So as I said, I never really use those variables, so I don't really know what they do. But now you know that you can set those variables if you want to. And there's probably a few other variables in there that I never really heard of either. So yeah, if you want, you can use the factory to set a few settings while creating your asset. In my case, I don't really think it's worth using the factory for a world asset, but that's what I had. So here it is. I have my world asset using a factory. Yay. Okay, now I have my factory. I set all the settings that I want to set in the factory. Now I can simply use it to create the asset, and that's super simple because we already created the function for it, the create asset function. I'm just feeding it the path. Here we go. I have my path. Then we need the class of the asset we want to create. So the static class of uWorld, because we want to create a uWorld asset. Perfect. Super simple. And finally, the factory right here, which is the new object we just created. So good. Now we are able to create the asset using the create asset function and the new factory we used. And as output, that should return us the object of the created asset if it worked. And then in my case, I'm just going to return that asset at the end of the function. But if I want to return a uWorld, well, I have to cast it to make sure that I really created a uWorld. So good. Okay, I created a UWorld asset and now I'm returning at the end. Super easy, super simple. Now we're gonna do the same thing with the material. So same thing, we want to use a factory. So let's create a factory. I have my new factory right here. So I'm creating a new object. This time it's going to be a U material factory new because that's the type of factory that creates material. And then we have the factory and we can use it to set some variable. And the only variable that is inside the material factory is actually the initial texture. And actually that variable right here is probably more useful than all the other variables that are for the world. For this initial texture, that's the texture that will appear in the material by default when you try to create a material from a texture. So in Unreal, if you right click on a texture and you try to create a material from there, it's going to create the material and also automatically add the texture inside it. And that's exactly what it's doing right here. If you provide the texture right here, it's going to automatically add it in the material for you. So that might be useful in your case. Or as I said before, this is also doable later. So if you create your material now and later on you want to add the texture in the material, that's also doable. You don't have to use the factory to be able to insert a texture inside the material. We're gonna see that in a future video probably. So yeah, you can use the factory if you want to add the texture in the material. In my case, I never use it. I just add my texture myself. So you can use the factory if you want to, but you don't have to if you don't need to. So good. Now we have a factory, so we're gonna use it because, well, it's there, so why not? I'm going to create my asset, providing the asset path. Once again, the class of the asset we want to create, so it's a U material this time. We want to create a material, so the static class of that material is going to return us the class. And finally, the factory, because we want to use the factory, which doesn't do anything because we're not feeding any texture, but whatever, we have a factory anyway. So good, we have the factory, it's going to return us the asset, which I'm gonna cast into a material because I want to return a U material at the end of the function. And for all the other functions, well, it's going to be even simpler because for those functions we use the factory and it's super simple. We create the factory and then we can feed the factory to the create asset function. The same thing right here. I'm creating my factory and I'm feeding it to the create asset function. But for all those functions right here, we're going to keep it even simpler. We're not going to create a factory. So I'm just going to scroll down for those last functions right here. And we can simply call the create asset function right away. We just have to feed it the path of where we want to save the asset in the content browser, the class of asset we want to create. So in my case, a ULevelSequence because I'm in the create LevelSequence asset. It makes sense. So I'm creating a ULevelSequence. I'm setting the factory to be null. So I'm not feeding any factory to my create asset function and it's going to find a factory for me. So good. And then it's going to return us the asset, which I'm going to cast into a ULevelSequence because that's the asset type I want to create. And then same thing for Niagara. I'm just going to create an asset, feeding it the asset path. The asset class is a new NiagaraSystem. I'm not providing a factory and it's going to return me an object which I'm going to cast into a new NiagaraSystem to be able to return it at the end. And then same thing for all the last functions that we have right here. So I'm creating an asset, the asset path we're providing it, we say which class we want to use, so the SoundCue right here, no factory, cast it to a SoundCue at the end, and then create another asset, user defined enum this time to create an enum, same thing, no factory, then we cast it to a user defined enum, and finally same thing for the structure at the end. Create another asset, asset path, the structure, no factory, it returns us an object that we then can cast into a user defined struct and return it to the user. Perfect. So that's it. We're done with all the functions. And yeah, I really went overboard with the examples. Anyway, so now it's time to jump in Unreal to see if it works. So as usual, in Unreal, I created myself a little user interface to be able to test all that super quickly. So here it is. I have my new user interface. In here, I have a few buttons that lets me create a world, material, level sequence, Niagara, SoundCue, Enum, and structure assets. And when I click on those buttons, it's going to use the path that is written beside it. So here, my material path, level sequence path, and everything. So good. It's going to be simple for us to create as many assets as we want using those buttons, and it's going to be way faster for me to show you if it works. So good, I'm just gonna go in the graph to show you the graph real quick. So here I'm creating the world asset when I'm clicking on the create asset world button using the path of my world asset. Same thing for the material, create material asset, which is the function we created also using the path that is assigned with my material button, level sequence, NiagaraSystem, and then if I go down a little bit more, before, SoundCue using the path of the SoundCue, Enum using the path of the Enum, and finally structure. Perfect. So it's going to be super simple. I'm going to go back in Unreal and run the editor utility widget right here. It's going to be a little bit lower because it's getting packed. And now I have all my different buttons and the paths are inside the test folder. So to see if it works, I'm just going to open the test folder right here. And now I don't have any assets named 9 whatever after them. So if I click on the button, it should create the asset for us. So create the world. Here we go. It created a world. Then material, LevelSequence, NiagaraSystem, SoundCue, Enum, and Struct. Perfect. And I'm now able to create as many assets as I want simply by clicking on the button. If I try to create an asset that already exists, Unreal is going to ask me, okay, do you want me to re-import on top of that one or create on top of it? Yes, I want to override that asset, and Unreal is going to override the asset for us. So that's good. It's an idea. Or if you don't want to do that, you can just say no, and then Unreal is just going to not do the asset creation because there's already an asset with that name. Same thing if you write a path name that doesn't make sense. So with invalid characters, Unreal is just going to tell you, hey, I cannot process that because, well, it contains invalid characters. So yeah, that's not great. But as long as your asset name has valid characters in them, you can create as many assets as you want, and it's super quick. And yay, it works good. So I guess that's gonna be it for today's video, and I'm gonna see you in the next one. Bye bye.